The dust settled on Jesse McCoy's last honest stand, and with it, everything he'd ever called home. Silver Ridge stretched before him like a mirage of second chances, its elegant facades hiding the same cruelties he'd left behind. When Eleanor Whitmore's carriage stopped beside his weary horse, he didn't know that mercy could wear silk gloves and speak in whispers that cut deeper than any foreman's curse. Her mansion rose from the desert like a cathedral of secrets, and Jesse found himself walking through gates that would either save his soul or claim it entirely. The widow's eyes held promises he couldn't name, and gifts he wasn't sure he deserved to receive. The morning Jesse McCoy lost his job, the sun rose blood-red over the Broken Arrow Ranch, painting the sky the color of everything he was about to leave behind. He'd thrown his last punch for justice the night before, his knuckles still raw from connecting with Foreman Bradley's jaw when he'd caught the man whipping young Tommy Martinez for spilling grain. The boy couldn't have been more than 16, all bones and terror, and something in Jesse's chest had snapped like a dry branch when he heard the leather crack against flesh. Now he sat on the edge of his narrow bunk, rolling his few possessions into a worn bedroll, each item a small monument to a life that had just ended. His hands moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd learned early that everything could disappear in a heartbeat. But his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for flight. The other cowboys avoided his eyes as he walked through the bunkhouse, their silence thick as molasses and twice as bitter. Jesse understood their fear. Jobs were scarce as water in August, and standing up to Bradley meant signing your own walking papers. But understanding didn't ease the ache of isolation that settled in his chest like a stone. He'd always been the one they came to when the work got too hard, or the bosses got too cruel, the steady presence who never bent under pressure. Now he was just another drifter with a reputation for trouble, and the weight of that transformation pressed down on his shoulders like a yoke he couldn't shake. The irony wasn't lost on him that doing the right thing had made him the wrong kind of man to keep around. Outside, his horse Dusty waited with the patience of an old friend, her brown eyes reflecting the same weariness that had settled into Jesse's bones. She'd been with him through 3 ranches and twice as many heartbreaks, the only constant in a life that seemed determined to keep moving. He stroked her neck and whispered promises he wasn't sure he could keep, about finding work, about staying together, about not ending up like the broken men who haunted the saloons with their empty pockets and emptier dreams. The morning air carried the scent of sage and possibility, but Jesse could only smell the dust of another ending. His 36 years felt like a century of goodbyes, each one teaching him that honor was a luxury most men couldn't afford. The ride away from Broken Arrow stretched before him like a sentence without punctuation, endless and uncertain. Jesse had heard talk of Silver Ridge, a town where money flowed like water and opportunities bloomed for men willing to bend their principles just enough. The thought sat uneasily in his stomach, but pride was a poor companion when your belly was empty and your prospects were thinner than paper. He'd built his life on the belief that a man's word was his bond and his actions defined his worth. But the world seemed determined to punish him for those convictions. Every mile that passed beneath Dusty's hooves felt like another step away from the man he'd tried to be, and towards someone he wasn't sure he wanted to become. As the sun climbed higher, Jesse found himself thinking about Tommy Martinez, and wondering if the boy would remember why he'd been saved, or just that he'd been abandoned afterward. The thought gnawed at him like a persistent ache. The knowledge that his gesture of protection had ultimately left the kid more vulnerable than before. It was the cruel mathematics of justice in a world that rewarded compliance over courage. One man's stand could cost everyone around him their security. Jesse had learned this lesson before, but somehow he kept forgetting it when it mattered most, his conscience overriding his common sense like a horse that refused to be broken. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, and Jesse McCoy rode toward Silver Ridge, carrying the weight of every right thing he'd ever done wrong. The dust cloud behind him settled into memory, And Jesse realized he was riding towards something he couldn't name, but desperately needed. A place where his choices might finally make sense, where the price of integrity wouldn't always be paid in loneliness and regret. Silver Ridge emerged from the desert heat like a fever dream of civilization, its whitewashed buildings gleaming against the harsh landscape with an almost defiant elegance. Jesse had expected another rough frontier town, all saloons and gambling halls, but this place wore its wealth like a Sunday dress, carefully pressed and deliberately displayed. The streets were wider than most, lined with establishments that bore names like Whitmore Banking and Trust and the Silver Rose Hotel, their painted signs speaking of permanence and prosperity. Even the dust seemed cleaner here, as if the money that flowed through the town had somehow purified the very air. Jesse felt suddenly conscious of his worn clothes and the 3-day stubble that shadowed his jaw, aware that he looked exactly like what he was, a drifter with nowhere else to go. The townspeople moved with the measured pace of those who'd never known real hunger, their clothes cut from fabrics that probably cost more than Jesse made in a month. Women in silk dresses navigated the wooden sidewalks with practiced grace, their parasols creating small circles of shade that seemed to follow them like personal clouds. Men in tailored suits conducted business with handshakes that looked more like rituals, their voices carrying the confident tones of those who'd never doubted their place in the world. Jesse guided Dusty down the main street, feeling like an intruder in a world that operated by rules he'd never learned. The contrast between this polished prosperity and the raw desperation he'd left behind at Broken Arrow was so stark it made his chest tight with something that might have been envy or might have been grief. It was outside the Silver Rose Hotel that Jesse first saw Eleanor Whitmore, though he didn't know her name then. She was simply the most elegant woman he'd ever laid eyes on, stepping from a black carriage with the fluid grace of someone born to command attention. Her dress was the color of midnight, cut in lines that suggested rather than revealed, and her dark hair was arranged in a style that spoke of both fashion and practicality. But it was her eyes that stopped Jesse's breath, grey as storm clouds, and twice as mysterious, holding depths that seemed to see everything and reveal nothing. She paused on the hotel steps, her gaze sweeping the street with the casual authority of someone who owned more than she could ever use. And for a moment, those eyes met his across the dusty expanse. The contact lasted only seconds, but Jesse felt something shift inside his chest, like a door opening in a room he'd forgotten existed. The woman, Eleanor, though he wouldn't learn her name for hours yet, seemed to study him with the same intensity he'd seen in horse traders evaluating stock. But there was something else in her expression, something that looked almost like recognition. Jesse touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect that felt both automatic and inadequate, and she responded with the slightest nod before disappearing into the hotel's shadowed interior. The entire exchange had lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but Jesse found himself sitting straighter in his saddle, suddenly aware of the picture he must present, a dusty cowboy on a tired horse, carrying everything he owned in a bedroll that had seen better decades. The woman's attention had been like sunlight through a window, brief but warming, and its absence left him feeling strangely cold. Jesse spent the rest of the afternoon making inquiries about work, visiting the various ranches and businesses that surrounded Silver Ridge like satellites around a wealthy planet. The responses were polite but firm. No positions available. Perhaps try again in a few months. Good luck elsewhere. Each rejection was delivered with the kind of practiced courtesy that made it clear his reputation had preceded him. That word of his confrontation with Bradley had somehow traveled faster than his horse. By evening, Jesse found himself at the Dusty Spur Saloon, nursing a whiskey he couldn't afford and contemplating the very real possibility that his principles had finally priced him out of honest work. The irony was bitter as the liquor. In a town built on money, his integrity had become a liability he couldn't afford to carry. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting Silver Ridge in shades of gold and shadow, Jesse McCoy sat alone at a corner table and wondered if this was how a man's convictions finally killed him, not in a blaze of glory, but in the slow starvation of being too honest for a dishonest world. The third morning brought with it a silence that felt different from the others. Jesse woke to find Eleanor already gone from the house, her absence marked only by the faint scent of lavender that lingered in the hallway and a plate of warm biscuits left on the kitchen table. He ate slowly, each bite carrying the strange weight of charity he had never learned to swallow gracefully. Through the window, he watched the hired hands moving about their tasks with the easy rhythm of men who belong somewhere, and he felt the familiar ache of being perpetually outside looking in. The work that day took him to the far pastures, where Eleanor's cattle grazed beneath a sky so vast it seemed to mock the smallness of human concerns. Jesse found himself repairing fence posts with an intensity that bordered on desperation, as if the straightness of each rail could somehow align the crooked circumstances of his life. His hands, scarred from years of honest labor, moved with practiced efficiency, but his mind wandered to the woman who had given him this chance without asking for explanations or promises. By midday, the sun had grown merciless, and Jesse sought shade beneath a lone cottonwood that stood like a sentinel in the endless grassland. He removed his hat and wiped the sweat from his brow, thinking of all the men he had known who had accepted charity and lost themselves in the process. There was something about being beholden to another person that ate away at a man's core, leaving him hollow and grateful in ways that felt like slow poison. When Eleanor appeared on horseback in the distance, riding with the grace of someone born to command both animals and landscapes, Jesse felt his chest tighten with an emotion he could not name. She approached slowly, her dark riding habit making her appear like a figure from a dream, and when she dismounted near his tree, the very air seemed to shift around them. Her eyes, those mysterious depths that held secrets he was beginning to suspect might destroy him, studied his face with an intensity that made him want to look away. "You work as if you're trying to prove something," she said, her voice carrying that same musical quality that had haunted his sleep. Jesse stood, hat in hand, feeling suddenly like a schoolboy caught in some unnamed transgression. The space between them felt charged with unspoken questions, and he found himself wondering what she saw when she looked at him. Whether it was the man he had been, the man he was becoming, or something else entirely. The afternoon stretched before them like an unwritten page, full of possibilities that both terrified and thrilled him, and Jesse realized that whatever Eleanor Whitmore's true intentions might be, he was already too far gone to turn back now. The evening of the seventh day brought with it a storm that seemed to rise from the very soul of the desert, dark clouds gathering like accusations against a sky that had been too blue for too long. Jesse found himself trapped in the main house as rain lashed against the windows with a fury that matched the turmoil in his chest. Eleanor moved through the rooms like a ghost made flesh, lighting lamps against the gathering darkness, and each flicker of flame seemed to illuminate new mysteries in her face. They sat together in the parlor, the first time they had shared such intimate space, and Jesse felt the weight of her presence like a physical thing. The room itself seemed to breathe with secrets, portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes followed his movements, books whose titles spoke of worlds beyond his understanding, and everywhere the subtle evidence of wealth that had never known want or uncertainty. Eleanor poured brandy from a crystal decanter, her movements precise and graceful, and when she handed him the glass, their fingers brushed in a contact that sent electricity through his entire being. "Tell me about the man you defended," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the sound of rain like a blade through silk. Jesse nearly choked on his drink, surprised by the directness of her question and the way it seemed to strip away all pretense between them. He had not spoken of that day to anyone, had carried the memory of it like a stone in his chest, but something in her eyes demanded honesty. in a way that made lies impossible. He told her about Miguel Santos, barely 18 and far from home, who'd been beaten by the foreman for the crime of asking for water during the hottest part of the day. He described the sound of the whip, the way the boy had fallen to his knees in the dust, and how something inside Jesse had snapped like a dry branch in a high wind. The words came slowly at first, then in a rush that surprised him with its intensity, and Eleanor listened without judgment, her dark eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, the silence between them felt different, deeper, more honest, charged with the kind of understanding that comes only when two souls recognize something fundamental in each other. Eleanor set down her glass and moved to the window, her silhouette framed against the storm-dark glass, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that made Jesse's heart race with anticipation and dread. "I brought you here for a reason, Jesse McCoy," she said, and in those words he heard the echo of his own destiny calling, sweet and terrible as the song of sirens leading sailors to their doom. The morning after the storm dawned clear and merciless, as if the desert had washed itself clean of all pretense and was ready to reveal its deepest truths. Jesse woke to find Eleanor waiting for him in the kitchen, but this time there was something different in her bearing, a resolution that seemed to have crystallized overnight like frost on glass. She wore a simple blue dress that made her eyes appear almost luminous, and in her hands she held a leather portfolio that seemed to pulse with significance. "Walk with me," she said, and her voice carried a finality that made Jesse's stomach clench with anticipation. They moved through the house in silence, past rooms he had glimpsed but never entered, until they reached a study lined with books and dominated by a massive oak desk. Eleanor gestured for him to sit in a chair that felt too fine for his weathered frame, and when she opened the portfolio, Jesse saw papers covered with legal script that might as well have been written in a foreign language. "This ranch," Eleanor began, her voice steady but touched with an emotion he could not identify, "has been in my family for 3 generations. My husband expanded it, made it profitable, but he died without giving me the one thing I wanted most." She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of the papers, and Jesse felt the world shifting beneath him like sand in an hourglass. "He left me wealthy beyond measure, but he left me alone, and wealth without purpose is just another kind of poverty." The words that followed seemed to come from very far away, as if Jesse were hearing them through water or in a dream that felt too vivid to be real. Eleanor spoke of watching him work, of seeing in his dedication and integrity the kind of man her husband had never been. She talked about legacy and purpose, about the difference between owning land and belonging to it, and with each word, Jesse felt his understanding of the world crumble and reform like clay in a potter's hands. When she finally pushed the papers across the desk toward him, her eyes bright with unshed tears, Jesse stared at the documents as if they were serpents ready to strike. The words, "deed of ownership," seemed to dance before his vision, and he realized that Eleanor Whitmore was not offering him employment or charity, but something far more dangerous and precious. She was offering him a future he had never dared to imagine. "I don't want your gratitude," she said, her voice breaking slightly on the words. "I want your partnership. I want to build something together that will outlast both of us, something that honors the land and the people who work it." Jesse looked up from the papers to find her watching him with an intensity that seemed to burn through all his defenses, and he understood that this moment would divide his life into before and after, that whatever choice he made would echo through all his remaining days. The silence stretched between them, like a bridge he was afraid to cross, and Jesse McCoy realized that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as the most terrifying responsibilities, and that accepting grace might be the bravest thing a man could ever do. 3 years had passed since that autumn revelation, and the ranch had become something neither Jesse nor Eleanor could have imagined alone. The land stretched before them like a promise kept, dotted with cattle that bore the mark of their shared vision, and workers who understood that dignity was not negotiable here. Jesse's hands, once calloused only by other men's dreams, now shaped something that belonged to both of them. A legacy built not on inheritance, but on the radical act of two wounded souls choosing to trust again. Eleanor moved through their home with a lightness that had replaced the careful composure of her widowed years. She had learned that love was not always about holding on, but sometimes about the courage to let someone else carry half the weight. Her laughter echoed through rooms that had once known only the echo of her own footsteps, and Jesse marveled daily at how a woman's joy could transform even the shadows in the corners of a house. The townspeople of Silver Ridge had long since stopped whispering about the unlikely pair, though they still watched with something approaching awe when Jesse and Eleanor rode together through the main street. There was something in the way they moved. Not as two people trying to become one, but as two complete souls who had chosen to walk the same path. Their love had become a kind of legend, proof that the heart's geography was vaster and more mysterious than anyone dared to believe. Jesse often found himself standing on the porch at sunset, watching Eleanor tend to her roses with the same careful attention she had once given to healing his pride. He understood now that her gift had never been the ranch or the money or even the second chance. It had been her willingness to see him not as a broken man in need of fixing, but as someone worthy of love exactly as he was. That recognition had changed everything, not just about how he saw himself, but about what he believed was possible in this hard, beautiful world. In the evenings, when the work was done and the land settled into its ancient rhythms, they would sit together on the steps and watch the stars emerge over their shared horizon. Neither spoke much during these moments, but the silence between them was full of everything they had built together, a testament to the truth that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with leaving home, but with finally having the courage to create one.